All right. Well, Tim, thank you so much for being a guest on the Tech Guys Who Invest podcast. We're excited to pick your brain about short-term rentals and how people can learn more about that. All right. So the first thing we want to ask you is, what are the advantages of short-term rental versus long-term rental?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. The way I usually describe it is we're kind of a hybrid. Short-term rental has been borrowed a little bit by the vacation rental industry, where nightly, weekly rentals are now being considered short-term rentals. And we've always been monthly minimums. So we are kind of a hybrid between nightly, weekly rentals and year-long unfurnished rentals. And so basically, the idea is the short-term rentals, we typically prefer, it's midterm is not the right term, but it's more called monthly rentals.
Sure.
But there are differences between, I'll start with the long-term rentals, which is the majority of investors out there would buy a property and just say, hey, renter, come in, unfurnished for a year. The renter pays utilities. And for us, our program is based on the property being fully furnished, including kitchenware. The owner pays utilities. And so what that usually, it doesn't always equal, but it's usually a 30 to 40% premium over the unfurnished year-long rental. You do have to subtract the utilities from that and potential vacancies. So it's not always a home run. And it's very location specific too, where we focus a lot in urban areas. Specifically, we're downtown DC, but the further out you get or further away from work environments, it's harder to keep occupancy rates high. So that's one other aspect of it too, though, is when you go furnished, you're targeting businesses, and the businesses are paying the rent, not individuals. So there is a lot more security on getting the rent collected, which was one of the primary drivers of starting the business.
So, Tim, that's pretty interesting, and it sounds like you're differentiating yourself a little bit from vacation rentals. And you mentioned businesses. I think I know what your targeted clientele is, but could you expand on that just a little bit and share with us the typical type of customer who would rent a short-term rental from you?
Sure. So our renters, the way I describe it, the majority of our renters are business travelers who aren't paying the rent themselves, and or what it's a lot of government in DC, or it's one step removed, where you have a business coming in on a government contract. And, the reason the business model exists and thrives is because the cost savings are there. So you can rent it. We're going to be 30 to 40% cheaper than a hotel, and 30 to 40 more expensive than a unfurnished rental. But you get the flexibility of furnished, you get monthly terms, and you get a kitchen, all those benefits. Some of those benefits you see in the Airbnb vacation rental world, but with 30-day long rentals.
Okay, that's a great way of breaking it down. So thank you for that. Now, when it comes to finding these properties that you're talking about for short-term rentals, what are some key markers that you're seeing? Because when I think of vacation rental, I think, oh, this is has a cool theme to it. It's decorated nicely or has a good view, but that I'm a vacationer, right? But you're looking at more business people. So just out of curiosity, how do you determine what would be a good property or a good area?
So like most real estate, it's location based. So convenient, like in cities, you want to be near public transportation, near grocery, it's not dissimilar. Well, all real estate's kind of based on that. But for our market, when I first started out back in 2001, it was, location, but the properties could be a little bit older, just because there wasn't a lot of other options out there. And now the bigger trend is making sure it's modern, making sure it's, when we first started, a lot of the furniture was kind of left over or maybe even inherited. And, when I talk to property owners now, it's like, no one really wants to rent grandma's place. So you want to make sure the furnishings look modern and sleek, and something that is either as good as where they live, or a step above what their current home situation looks like. Also, keep in mind, these people who are business travelers are usually, vacation, they're excited to be there. Business travelers can be excited, but they're also being put out, meaning that they're spending time away, 3 or 4 months on average from their family. And they want all the conveniences. They want good service that you don't see necessarily on unfurnished rentals, or not always on, vacation rentals.
So, Tim, how are business customers finding your properties?
You want me to give the secret sauce this early? No, we, part of it is we've been around for a while, and, did the hard slog before the internet put ads up on the classifieds of newspapers. And then, just kind of knocked on doors and set up a reputation. I will tell you, one of the benefits of short-term rentals are when you make a lot of mistakes early on, in 3 or 4 months, people are going to leave and maybe never use you again. But, it's also, there's a benefit to not being burden, people for long term. So we got the early years were a lot of mistakes, but we typically now word of mouth, a lot of advertising. We try to do a little more fun approach where we have a couple vehicles that are unusual, roaming the streets, wrapped with marketing. We won an award a couple of years ago because we wrapped one of our smart cars with a map of DC, which isn't that unusual. But what we did was we did business cards that are shaped like the push pin on maps that are stickers, and it says, "Please take one." And we moved the stickers around the car to show where our inventory is, and people can pull the stickers off. And so we try to have fun with it and change it up a little bit just to help get our word out and differentiate from other providers out there.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. That's interesting, and not quite what I was envisioning. So I'm glad you cleared it up.
Yeah.
I thought maybe, and I'm not very well educated on this business model, but I thought maybe it was kind of like a hotel's website where business people who want to travel for business would go out and look on a website somewhere. But it sounds like it's a little different than that.
Yeah, we do. Early on, we were going to like the concierge at hotels and just kind of like dropping off business cards saying, "Hey, if people are here and they want actually a home cooked meal instead of eating everything out, And we would get approached by people who said, "I've been in a hotel for 6 months. I'm so glad I found you," And also you get people who have so many hotel points that they're fine not, getting any more, and they just want a comfortable place to stay versus, jamming on the points.
Yeah. So instead of being in a hotel, they want something that feels more like home, and that's where you come in.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just nice. People do the math. Even if they go home every weekend, committing for a month or 3 months is still significant, and they get more space, and they get more, they get a kitchen, and they don't have to pick up their bags every, Thursday or Friday and, clean up. They just can kind of leave everything. So from an investor's perspective, I usually tell owners, I go, we have what you could consider our ideal tenants. They're not paying the rent themselves. They're hardly there. If you think about corporate, the company is paying these people to go to another city, and if they could do the work remotely, they would save on that expense. So they're not camping out on the property. They're on the ground. They're meeting the locals. They're workers, or they're part of the relocation. So they're not spending a ton of time in the property. And that's another difference that, if you go vacation rental, the model, if you're not paying the rent yourselves, the model works if you can cram, not always, but if you can get more people into a 1-bedroom, with pull-out sofa beds, you're saving a ton of money on getting more than one hotel room, and that's why that business model exists. We don't see that for corporate rentals because they want comfort and convenience and, less wear and tear because they're not there all the time.
Interesting. So that makes sense. When I think about if I've stayed at a hotel for extended periods of time, you get kind of tired of it. You want to feel something a bit different. So that's awesome that you brought that up. Now, with the acquisition of these properties, I'm thinking for long-term rental, you typically are buying that property to then rent it out. But I can imagine in your business model, that would take a lot more capital, and there's a lot more turnover with yours. So I was just curious as to how that process works.
Usually I usually encourage people to talk to us before they buy, just to make sure that they can kind of get an estimate on the numbers. And we obviously talk to people after they buy too. And, and I always tell people, as much as I'd love to be the highest and best use of your property, frequently we're not. The home run is when we come in and we can beat the numbers and everything works. It's dependent on location, style, amenities that impact if you should go furnished monthly or not. Regulations come into play too on what's allowed and what's not. The 30-day minimums, by and large, are a lot of cities are using that designation to separate vacation short-term rentals from unfurnished rentals. But from an investor's perspective, the additional costs are going to be utilities on and if you buy a condo, sometimes all the utilities except for internet are included anyway, so it could or could not be a differentiator. Furnishing a property, we have a handful of, a lot of people early on said they lived in a one-bedroom condo and they're getting married, and they're like, we got two of everything, and the furniture that we have here won't fit in where we're moving or we're going somewhere, and so it's easier to keep the furniture in here. And so for a lot of our owners, it's a great solution just on that sense. And then some of our investor developer owners can buy furniture in bulk in packages to keep that furniture cost down. But, still for investors, it's a numbers game. Would I spend $10,000 on furniture? That means I need to make at least that much more, in over a 1 or 2 year term, or I'm just going to go unfurnished. And, so really it does come down to primarily numbers, but then it's, some owners are like, I want flexibility. I may come back every year for Christmas and New Year's, or, I have family here and I want to see them once a month. And so I'm going to try to rent it out outside of that. Other people will say, hey, rent it as long as possible. Once it's vacant again, let me know, and I'll come back for 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months, and then we'll rent it again. And other people are just like, rent it until you hear from me again. So we provide a lot of flexibility. And so while it's typically the highest ROI, or people give us property to find out, how I can get the best return, the other option is I want higher quality tenants typically, and I want the ability to use it from time to time, and that sometimes equals, sometimes counteracts the return. And we talk to owners to see which they prefer, and we devise our system around what works for them.
So that's pretty interesting. Tim, does your company own any of the properties, or are you really only providing these services and helping owners of the properties get them rented to these clients?
So my wife and I own a handful of properties, not the majority, and we have a couple investor owners who have, I think our largest investor has, it's probably around 12%. But so it's almost one property per owner. Out of roughly 300 properties, we have about 200 different owners. And so it is, I usually tell people we're not necessarily in the real estate business or corporate housing business. We're in the personality business, because we're the go-between between owners' wants and needs and the renters, who are property owners themselves. 90% of them are, and they have their wants and needs. And so we we're battling for peace between those two frequently, but most people are reasonable and they appreciate the service we provide.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I think that's a good service that with the advent of things like Airbnb, VRBO, all of those, a lot more people are starting to understand that, hey, this is a possibility. But I know that you're operating from a different perspective, going after professional tenants.
Yeah, I mean, there are companies out there now who are property management companies like ourselves that focus solely or primarily on, Airbnb's platform and HomeAway's platform, and that's how they find, October 1 in DC, that is going to be, you can't rent for less than 30 days unless it's your primary residence, and then if it's your primary residence, you can only do 90 days. Everyone says, oh, how are they going to enforce it? When are they going to enforce it? And I think they're right. I mean, I also say, you're also supposed to pay your taxes, and there's some people who don't do that. So, it's like, it just becomes a game of like, you can do it until someone says stop, and hopefully the penalty is not severe. But we're well positioned for these new regulations to come in play, and it's happening it exists in New York, LA, Massachusetts and Boston are rolling it out. I know Barcelona. So we pay attention to it. And I wrote a big article on why it makes sense to regulate it and why it exists, and why, really the bad players are, in a lot of people's minds, are these corporations that are coming in and commercializing the Airbnb experience, whereas the mom and pops and the individuals who get one or two investment properties, I don't think should be regulated. And the hotels don't care about the one or twos, and the hotels don't care about shared living. They're just trying to cut down on the commercial operators, but the HomeAways and the Airbnbs of the world need these large providers to grow their market as they look to go public. It's faster to get a big developer that brings in hundreds of units, even at the risk of losing the authentic, local experience, because it just brings in more money.
Yeah, that's a really interesting angle on that whole business and the industry within that I think most people don't have. So appreciate you providing that, because you're in the industry. You have a unique perspective there.
Yeah, and I have a lot of friends and people I know in town who have 8 and 10 unit buildings that are zoned commercial, that are in an area that allows for nightly, weekly rentals. And I'm like, you're great. You're not the neighbor, you're next to commercial buildings. You're not upsetting neighbors. You're paying the taxes like everyone should. And it's just more of getting the restrictions in place, such as fire codes and other stuff. So, but once you go residential area, you have the neighbors complaining, you have other restrictions that, I explained it to people. I'm like, the uncertainty, if you are in a condo and you live next door to a rental, you could have 12 great renters in a row, and that 13th one is a bachelor party, or they bring a dog and you can't sleep at night. And all of a sudden the uncertainty of being a neighbor affects your quality of life pretty significantly. And then if there aren't rules to protect that, it can cause a lot of problems. And a lot of times people will say, oh, the sharing is similar to the car sharing, the Uber and Lyfts. But the difference is what I call the neighbor factor. If your neighbor's driving for Lyft or Uber, you don't care, it doesn't impact you. But if your neighbor is renting their house out all the time to various groups and parties, and that does have an impact on you, and that you either join in, complain, or start renting your place out too. But it has a bigger impact.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
that
with
makes
that,
total sense.
You're talking about regulations on a couple different sides, and I wanted to break that down. So you're talking about the time at which somebody has to rent, like a minimum stay, but you're also talking about the zoning for commercial.
Yep.
So I know that it varies by city and by state as well, even to the county level.
Yeah.
You have to be aware of that. So what should somebody be looking for if they're interested in kind of doing the same business model that you are?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of the Wild West, and my take on it is if I were an investor, I'd want to know the regulations versus, well, maybe, and so if I were an investor, I would try to talk to experts, try to research online, see what's going on regulations so you can buy with confidence. I mean, I know a couple of years ago, some investors bought some big buildings with what I call a fingers crossed approach, where they're renting them out nightly in direct violation of the laws of residential zoning, which is rarely enforced. But when you start getting neighbors upset, they start nitpicking on that stuff. And now someone got a huge fine and had to take his 12-unit building from nightly back to annual. And I'm like, that pro forma just took a massive hit. He bought it with that intention and hoping that it would work out. And so why I'm pushing regulation is partially for investors. So you're like, I'm going to buy with confidence. I want to know what the rules are so I can play. And, and so then you can even find these, what I call diamonds in the rough. If you can find a residential building that's zoned commercial, there aren't a lot of them. And I'm just using DC as an example, but you can then do nightly all you want. And those numbers are 30 to 40% higher than, our numbers. And when I talk to people who said, should I use your model and it's zoned commercial? I'm like, absolutely not. I'm like, you should ride the nightly wave all day long and just, take in all that money, build out a system for the, constant turnover and the maids, but it's solvable. It's not impossible. And you will see the rewards with that model.
I like that. So you're talking about the fingers crossed approach is something that Adam and I are definitely adamantly against because you're taking a huge risk and that you don't want to do that. So you said, make sure you know the regulations, not speculation, but being able to actually read it, talk to experts, maybe even talk to community leaders, right? People that are on boards to understand, hey, is this possible? What do I need to look out for?
These topics are very polarizing. And so, I think it's, doing a Google search and then finding the politician or an advocacy group will be able to easily tell you what regulations are coming down the pipeline or what's been approved or what's being changed. So you kind of have an idea, but, so there is kind of a gamble, but once you know what's in place, you can buy with more confidence. You can sometimes find a property that like, hey, I'm going to buy this. And if this passes, it still makes money versus buying something and it really only works if a law changes one way or the other. That's, I wouldn't recommend that, not on real estate.
It's very much a gamble there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're thinking like a professional, someone who owns and runs a business and is very professional. And I know there are a lot of mom and pops out there who don't think that way. And
well, yeah, it's long-term versus short-term a little bit too. And long-term thinking and planning, which is like, I will tell you, we have a couple clients who, when this regulation came out last year that, hey, October 1 of 2019, they're changing. They said, hey, Tim, we're going to go nightly, weekly for the next year because now we know and it's going to change and we're just going to run up as much money as possible. And as much as I didn't like losing the business, I couldn't compete with it. And as much as I looked at getting into it, it would have been a short-term win for a long-term loss. And, I was just on the phone with a couple of them last week where they're like, hey, October 1, we're coming back in because they don't want to risk it. It's part of it, so.
Yeah. So Tim, this is a pretty interesting business model. How did you get into it? What kind of gave you the idea to get into this business?
Yeah. It was one of those, I'm from the Midwest. I'm from St. Louis. My wife's from Wisconsin, and we met in college, and both of our parents, when they started out, bought like duplexes. And I remember them telling me at a young age, they go, oh, we saved up money, bought a duplex, and we rented out half. And that rental income paid our mortgage, so we got to live there for free. And, never great at school. And I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense to me, right? Where it's like you spend a little bit more and now you have some, yes, you have headaches. Hopefully you find good renters, but the headaches are probably worth living in a place for free and building up more equity and then borrowing against it to leverage to buy more. And so our first property that we bought was a 3-bedroom, but it didn't have a separate rental. And this was 99. But we had a spare bedroom. So we rented to a college kid, and it was just my wife and I, and we used that money to save up and buy our first investment property. And that one was furnished. It was a English studio basement apartment. And I think it was furnished because it was so far down that you couldn't get the furniture back out this narrow stairwell.
Nice.
And it did look like grandma's place, and it was dungeon-esque, but it was a great location. And I didn't know well enough other than that, hey, I can get $100 more than a unfurnished one or two, and it was razor thin margins on it, but it was my first foray in it. And I kind of liked the people that I met, because we're in DC. So you meet like a World Bank person, and they're homeowner. And so they know how to take care of a place, and they're different than your traditional renters. And I'm not trying to put down traditional renters, but it's just a different type of interaction. And so the next one we bought, we then forked out money to, but went on at that time Craigslist to buy used furniture and furnished it. And, then I started managing a couple of friends' properties, and, now we're sitting at about 300 properties.
Wow. Yeah, that's a cool story, man.
I do want to emphasize, while it's like 300, wow, that's a lot. I know a couple guys who started a traditional property management company around the same time that I did, and they're at, more than 3,000. So, they're just, wow. It's not, it's all relative. I knew early on, I go, hey, if I'm going to go down this path, it's going to be a harder slog because it's a niche. Businesses are different. There are fewer of them, but I like the model enough to give it a go and, and try it out. And it's been a good ride so far.
Nice.
That's fantastic. We love that origin story there.
That's awesome.
We've talked about a lot of the advantages of short-term rentals and your business model, but what would be some of the disadvantage that maybe investors who don't know the business that well seem to be overlooking or just aren't aware of?
So, there is a risk of vacancy. I feel lucky that we've been growing pretty much every year because we don't hold our owners hostage. Like if we're not able to get the numbers and rent it out, they can go elsewhere. They, sell, they go unfurnished, they'll sometimes go nightly, weekly, but, so the risk is the uncertainty of, occupancy rates and rental rates. There is some uncertainty of, I guess that's about it. Cause you estimate utility costs. So you kind of know that going in, and then from our perspective, it's hard. So condo buildings in DC, 95% of them have 6-month or 12-month minimums. And so we work with buildings with 6-month minimums. We don't work with buildings with 12 months. And as much as I hated that when we started the business out, I've kind of learned to appreciate it because it makes it rarer to have a condo that you can actually do monthly rentals in. The risks are just that. I guess it's, you got to know what the uncertainty is. And if someone says, what's the difference between furnished and unfurnished, I'll usually tell them to talk to a traditional property management company because I don't always have the numbers of what the going rate of unfurnished rentals are, but almost anyone else can. And then I let them do the math to kind of say, hey, is the risk there? Is the benefit there? And let's go forward with it.
So Tim, the DC market can be tough for landlords.
Yeah.
How is it for your business?
Oh man, that's a great question. Yeah. I think you're referring to evictions.
Right.
I talked to a lot of people who, right or over the border is Virginia and Maryland, and they're like, I will not buy in DC. If someone stops paying, I can get them out in 30 days. If someone stops paying in DC, it's 3 or 4 months of agony, if not longer. And it can be pretty detrimental. What we do is we screen very strictly our renters, and I feel like the last year or so, we end up not approving probably about one person every 2 weeks because of fraudulent documentation, or they don't pass, it's, don't check my credit, or they make something up. And it's because they know once they get in, getting them out is very, very hard. And so it can happen to anyone, but we've been very lucky with it rarely happening. And it's usually when people get through, they have very elaborate. I mean, the first one we got stung with was someone who created a website with 2 years of history to it, and stolen identities, and very elaborate scams.
Wow.
And in a couple ways to look at it is like, what could we have done differently? Playing Monday morning quarterback there, we changed some of our practices, but when it gets to be that elaborate, it becomes not and when you've been doing it long enough and you have this volume, it becomes kind of not an if but when, and it sucks. But we basically, all the years, I think we've only had to deal with 3. Ironically, we're dealing with one right now, and it's because we did have a property on Airbnb with a 30-day minimum, and they required an instant booking. And so Airbnb brought this person in, which we couldn't screen, and now they're on month 3 right now without.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Yeah, that's tough.
And yeah, Airbnb is not being very, well, I'll be able to provide you an update in a couple of weeks on how it all plays out. But right now it's around $20,000 of past rent, legal fees, if not more.
What? Ouch.
Well, I guess that's a perfect segue into asking, how has Airbnb and other platforms like that affected your short-term rental business model?
That's an extreme case, and I don't think it's fair to. What I would say is the benefit that it's provided really is just made people aware and comfortable with the concept of renting someone else's property, or an untraditional rental that is not a chain hotel. And when I started in 2001, it was a big stretch. And now it's becoming very mainstream, and so one of the things we emphasize that makes us different is we let our renters see the property ahead of time. We give them the exact address, the price, they know all that going on. If you think about it, if you're renting for like 3 days, it's not a big time or money commitment. So an instant booking makes a ton of sense. If you're renting for 4 months and you're spending $20,000, some people will book sight unseen and, hope, but we like that we provide that showing service and, make sure that they're comfortable before they, write a big long-term lease at a property. The other component of it is, I guess the biggest thing is just the comfort level it's created with business communities. I was going to say the other thing is, we don't let property owners manage the properties themselves, just for consistency of experience for our renters, our business travelers. So that's kind of a differentiator as well.
Gotcha. Oh, interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah. So, with the possibility, the likelihood, some may say, that a correction is on the horizon.
Yeah.
some sort of a market condition. Have you thought about that and how that might affect your business? Is there anything you're doing to kind of prepare for that?
Mattress, burying my head in the sand. Yeah. What's the run and hide? No, I mean, it's not a matter, again, you look historically, it's not if, it's when. And, if you can time it, great. But, steps you can make. And, back in 2007, when the market crashed, we had an initial downturn, but then how we did well was that a lot of businesses that were what I would say sloppy with their expenses, staying in hotels unnecessarily, found us as a nice cost saving. I mean, they cut back on travel like most businesses did, and this will happen again. But I also see us as a value for business travelers who, are just like, I just want to get my points and stay in a hotel. From an investor's perspective, it's, if you can buy a property that can cash flow every month, increase in value, and, get your hard costs covered, those are good investments. They're hard to find.
Yeah.
And I would, another thing I like to give for advice is, especially in urban markets, I say, with everything going digital, how much space you actually need. Back in the day, you had these big TVs, you had big speakers, you needed books and all this stuff, and everything is like a phone and a laptop. And so when you come down to it, if you choose location over square footage, usually the trend, I mean, the extreme examples like New York and Hong Kong are becoming the norm in a lot of other cities, and DC is one of them, where just, call micro units or being efficient with space so that you can be in a good location and still be cost effective and without suffering quality of life. So if I were an investor, I would look at a large studio and, still make it legal, but build a wall, a closet, and make sure there's a window in there and turn it into a 1-bedroom, even though it's a smaller 1-bedroom. You'll be able to get higher rent, and you'll be able to, it'll increase the value of it if you want to sell, the resale value. Same thing goes for 2 or 3 bedrooms that you might be able to repurpose fairly easily without having to move any exterior walls. That gets expensive, but if, adding interior stuff is a good way to invest and prepare for a downturn.
Interesting. Yeah, good. Thanks.
Repurposing that. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah. But also staying within the regulations is huge, as we talked about already.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I think I'm biased. I'm such a fan of real estate, and it's treated me well. And, I mean, it's a lot of timing. It's a lot of luck. I wish I could say I was smart. My wife and I moved to DC back when a lot of people didn't think it was safe or there was much going on. And we bought, right after Marion Barry went out of office, there's a new mayor, and we're like, oh, we missed the boat. And what we bought back then, you can't get a studio for now. It was a 3-bedroom, 2.5 bath, 3-level row house with 4-car parking. And, and we thought we missed the boat because a year earlier it was 30,000 less, and I wish, I could have bought more back then, but
right.
It's like you just don't know. And, but I think as the world changes and they're saying millennials are not buying as much, and so I think that's an incentive to buy. So they got to rent somewhere, so might as well rent from your investment property. And people need a place to live, and if you buy in desirable areas, it should work out. So I encourage that as an investment tool.
Awesome. Now, speaking of, a lot of our listeners are W-2 employees, people with 9-to-5 jobs. How could they hypothetically begin investing in short-term rentals, whether it's in your business model or starting their own?
Well, I mean, I would say, primarily you could either, work with a realtor and identify, how much do you have? Can you put 20% or more down? Do you want to, invest in a larger building with people, who have experience with it. I mean, there's a bunch of different ways to go. And I know DC well, but then I know people who do what I do in almost majority of the cities around the country. So if people want to reach out to me, I'm happy to kind of put them in touch with other folks in other parts of the country. And I even have some folks over in Europe too, but it's really kind of just starting there and, knowing what your intentions are. I mean, I think talking about the recession, the stock market makes me really nervous right now.
Yep.
So putting money in there, it's kind of like, really, if it goes up, it's how much more? And again, eventually I'll be right. It'll go down at some point. So it's just kind of trying to guess, but
Yeah, makes sense.
Real estate's still more tangible. If you buy, what worked for my wife and I when we invested is like we spent a little bit more and bought in good areas. And I know a ton of people who've made investments in up and coming areas that, it's, they're putting in a metro, they're putting in a grocery store, and it's going to be big, and they made a ton of money on that. And I also know people who bet on that growth, further out or up and coming, and then the market goes down and those areas get hit harder more. And while we might not see, if you buy in established areas, you might not see the incredible growth in value, you also won't see, if a market turns, the great decrease as outside areas or up and coming areas tend to get hit by.
Yeah, now that is good insight, especially at this time in the cycle. I think that's really good insight. Tim, we are tech guys by day. We work day jobs and we invest, obviously, but we love asking our guests some kind of a tech question. So we wanted to ask you, what piece of tech makes your business easier, or some piece of tech you really like right now that is helping you in your business?
Wow. Well, I usually tell people I can talk about three things: travel, real estate, and technology. And I'm glad you asked me that. And I will tell you, I have a degree in journalism, and I do not, but I read like TechCrunch, Gizmodo, and all because I'm just fascinated by it. Because I think anyone should be aware of where the future is going, and knowing what's coming down the pipeline. And I'm definitely an early adapter. I did buy Google glasses. I have them like in a closet somewhere.
Oh yeah, awesome.
But right now we've built our own website, and every day I'm bipolar on it, where it's like, oh, it's great, it's the worst thing I've ever done, and there's no right answer. We've got quotes for all kinds of things, but the technology that I'm most excited about right now, I think it kind of relates to, I'm going to call it webhooks, Zapier, workflow integration, where instead of redoing all of our website, we are now kind of saying, hey, with a webhook and an Excel spread or a Google spreadsheet, we can transform workflow without having to do cutting and pasting or alerts, and without heavily investing in brand new software. And I think in some distant off future, it's going to be data point, database, query, result, workflow, platform agnostic approach. We're not there yet, but I'm nervous about building a platform that becomes obsolete like everyone is, or, using a language that isn't used anymore. But if you think about data as the lifeblood or the gold of a business, and being able to access it and report on it and make it actionable, the nuts and bolts around it, the Docker technology, and then the kind of APIs, and getting, again, I'm sure there's some tech people out there that are going, you don't know, I can tell he's a journalist because he has no idea what you're talking about. So I sometimes use these terms and people are like, you're using them wrong. So the gist is that I'm excited about, these workflow integration webhook stuff.
Nice. Awesome, man.
Yeah, technology is meant to make your life easier, not necessarily harder.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I keep trying to remind myself that.
And speaking of technology, where can people find you? You mentioned your website, so we'd love to give you a plug there.
Oh, great. Yeah, no, we're at stayattache.com, which is STAYATTACHE.com. I mean, Attache Corporate Housing is the name. We have a hashtag Stay Attache for my staff, which does social media, which is, I guess, the Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn too, which I think is just linkedin.com, tim.touche maybe, but you can find me there. Happy to connect with people there. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk all this stuff. It's fun for me.
Great. Yeah, we'll put that stuff in the show notes for our listeners. Yeah, Tim, thanks a lot for coming on the show. I think you've added a lot of value to our listeners. It was really interesting to talk to you tonight.
Great. Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity. It was great chatting with you guys. I love the questions. I can talk this stuff all day. So, any follow-ups or anything you want, I'm happy to help out any way I can. And it's been an honor to be part of the show.